Good morning, everybody. I hope you all had as good as a Friday evening as I had. I see a very, very packed room. I think everybody is still full on in the conference mode. My name is Michiel. Online, I also go as MF. It does not stand for motherfucker, even though you would like to think so. What it exactly stands for, that's a whole different conversation. I want to warn everybody that this talk is not going to be technical at all. If you were expecting something incredibly technical, not this one. So, before I start, I would like to ask, who here has ever heard about the term cypherpunk? Can you just raise your hands? Okay, so a few people have not. That's great. Even better that all of you have actually already heard about this. It makes sense that our PR on cypherpunkism seems to be working. I'd like to start off going back a little bit in the past. Now, if you think about cypherpunks and the culture that we know it as today, it went through a lot of different experiences throughout the age of humanity. It didn't just start with the 1993 manifesto, on which we'll talk sooner also about. Just as much already in the 1600s, we had initial conversation through John Locke about what does privacy mean for today's society. And eventually that evolved even further with Foucault creating his prison where you're constantly being surveilled and watched, and thus creating a mental prison for a lot of people who might not actually be watched, but eventually have a constant state of surveillance. It ends up being a similar kind of a prison that you could expect by being actually watched, and thus was very efficient for people to behave under pressure and stress of being watched. This led further into a whole bigger situation as we went throughout the 19th century to the 20th century. We had the First and Second World War happening, and suddenly after the Second World War, we had a lot of people who became more aware of their environment, let's say so. Who here has not heard about George Orwell? Wow, you are all very educated, I like that. So in 1948, George Orwell wrote his book called 1984, which was kind of an evolution coming throughout the Second World War and the beginning of a very prosperous time within the United States or in generally the West. You could argue that suddenly, as we had the invention of the fridge, we had the invention of food and a level of safety, that now people had enough on top of their Maslow pyramid to actually care about their privacy. The other way around as well. The Cold War was just about in its footprints, and suddenly people cared more about what was happening to the East. What did they know? Who did they know? What did they know about you? A first representation of Big Brother was mentioned in the book 1984, where there's a singular party, not a singular person, as at least in the book, Big Brother was never defined to be a specific person that was watching you. Rather, a specific party or environment or authoritative being that would constantly surveil whatever you are doing. This image, especially for my Romanian friends in this room, might come a little bit familiar. This is taken back in the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken, regarding the back then dictator in Romania, and I will probably butcher his name, but Ceausescu? I'm sure all my Romanian friends definitely know about him, and for those who don't, I really recommend to watch the movie called Videograms of a Revolution, a documentary that goes deeper into this. Why is he so relevant, and although seemingly happy here, is due to his moving of control of the Securitate. A Securitate was back here in Romania just as much as we had the KGB, Stasi or CAA in the different parts of the country, although the Securitate had a bit of a different, let's say, reach. In 1973, their reach was going so far that a journalist called Emil Georgescu was almost assassinated in Germany. Back at the prime days of the Securitate, there were about 460,000 informants keeping track of what you were doing, what the people were doing, 460,000 people, that meant that if you would be in a classroom or if you would be in a movie theater, very likely there would be somebody constantly watching you, and what do you do? This kept building up, and especially in Romania, after 1989, when the revolution kind of started happening, we suddenly had the Iron Curtain falling away in Europe, which fell a bunch of upcoming, let's say, new mentalities of people who were able to at least escape some sense of their security surveillance origins. From here on, I'd like to bring it to or more of the digital environment as we all work and move in today. You had Eric Hux creating the Cypherpunk manifesto, which talked about how we should push for our own digital freedom and privacy. A very big switch from just being surveilled by wiretapped phones and being surveilled by the people around you and being pushed around and showcased based on your actual physical appearances, now suddenly also meant our digital appearances were becoming more and more important. Eric Hux wrote the manifesto back then, although he was more a representation of a general-wide movement and initial mention of cypherpunks that was happening then. What it exactly means to be a cypherpunk, I'll touch base in a moment, but eventually the main core point is that we suddenly needed to push for our own digital freedom because nobody would otherwise allow us. I'm sure you all heard about PGP being exported initially as ammunition. For those who have not, there's some pretty cool t-shirts that will tell you about how it was somehow seen as ammunition. And eventually they put the whole code in a book that would you allow to take outside of the country, because a book could not necessarily be seen as ammunition. It's important to see this kind of an act of rebelliousness as part of how cypherpunks have been moving both in the past and assumingly also in the future. There are always rules we need to keep ourselves to in a society we would like to live in. But at the same time, these rules have a limit and an edge that you actually need to follow. As long as you can stay within the thin lines, there's a lot of gray area where you can actually push through for your specific ideologies in that sense too. Within his manifesto, Eric Hux wrote a very clear message called Cypherpunk's Road Code. Now, who in this room here is technical and writes any sons of code? Okay, like 50%, let's say so. I would actually argue that, oh, it's the wrong button. Here we go. I would actually argue that the right code aspect of the cypherpunk mentality is today not that relevant anymore as it was back in 1993 or 1990s in general. Back then, to be able to have access to a computer, very likely you would be a privileged person. You would probably be living in a big city, being part of an educational program that gives you access to a mainframe, at least with the capacity to be able to build and compute any encryption models. You would need to have a general understanding of mathematics. You would need to have the socio-economical status where you would be able to determine at least a couple of years of your life to university instead of needing to work around the clock already. You would also need to be able to have the environment that is supportive of you to dedicate a large chunk of your time trying to understand the differences in the ones and zero. But today, all of us, all of you here, all of the people probably in this whole building have one, if not two, if not three, multiple computer devices on their pocket that can already run computations or run encryption algorithms. I would argue we are entering an era where we should be more aware and open towards the metaphor cypherpunks built. For those who have read the Cypherpunk manifesto or read part of the Cypherpunk mailing list, it will become clearly obvious that it is less about the actual physical aspect of needing to write code. It's less about writing another algorithm that can defend us against a surveillance state potentially using our information. It's more about proactively executing the ideas you have to be able to secure your own digital freedom and privacy in that sense. Building means not just writing code. In today's time, if you just write code, probably nobody will end up using it. You need some nice design, you need some people wanting to use it, you need people actually caring about using it. Especially because often people tend to say, oh, I have nothing to hide, why should I care about my privacy? Now, building is one of the main pushes that I'm trying to give through for the next generation in that sense, where we need to be open for people from any background wanting to contribute to this. In the end, building towards a cypherpunk future means 4 main topics one would support. I would almost call those a little bit as the principles of a cypherpunk culture, cypherpunk being. The private communications is obvious. We all have Signal, we all have end-to-end encryption systems. Being able to talk to the other person that you're trying to reach without a third-party eavesdropping becomes more and more important in a society where our information and communication becomes incredibly valuable for companies trying to understand what we want, where we want it, and when we want it. It also becomes more important for those people, like the journalist back in the 1970s that almost got assassinated, to make sure that whatever the people are writing about, you don't need to necessarily worry that you will get punished for your freedom of thoughts. Anonymity and pseudonyms is a part of a privacy/cypherpunk culture that it might be less only technical. Having the ability to create your own alter ego, having the availability to explore yourself as somebody who's growing up and becoming a new person and learning who you are, what you like, what you do, it's sometimes important to forget that the world is watching you. And the way you can enforce this is by creating your own pseudonyms. Just as MF is maybe not that anonymous of a pseudonym anymore, there's plenty of people in the communities I move in that tend to use only a pseudonym, so they can have some kind of a guarantee that whatever they tend to stand for does not follow them back to home, which creates a safety net for people to express their free mind, no matter if we support their opinion or not. This is also where the anti-censorship starts coming in. If you have the ability to communicate things without the worry that what you've communicated will be censored, you have an ability to make a change with your words that you write down or communicate with people. If people tend to censor you, not only might they hide the information you're trying to share, at the same side, they might actually censor specific parts of your information you're sharing and create a different narrative than what you actually stand for. All of us here in blockchain has heard a lot about anti-censorship, specifically when we're talking about financial utilities or tools. But sometimes it's simple to make sure that what you write or what you communicate does not get hidden and taken apart by somebody who has a different meaning. Now, the last but not least important part of hiding the hiding allows you to create an environment where you don't need to be afraid to utilize the tools you create. Sometimes you don't want to tell people what your secrets are or that you have a secret, because people are very curious beings. I like to know things I'm not supposed to know. I think you all like to know things you're not supposed to know in general. And the moment somebody feels that you're hiding something, no matter if it's a good or a bad thing, just general hiding, people tend to become way more curious and prying. This gets even worse when you're dealing with a sense of authority. I don't know if any of you have ever been stopped by, let's say, a police or border check. If you would tell them, oh, I'm actually hiding something, even you might just be hiding a Polaroid picture of your girlfriend and you together in a fun night in Paris, let's say. So, very, very likely they will not leave you alone for a good half hour to make sure that they figure out what are you hiding. Now, the tools we create, often you can also argue that, what about the bad guys? What about the terrorists? What about the pedophiles, the drug dealers? What about the, let's say, the bad people defined by the society we live in? Can't they use the same tools we are trying to build to protect ourselves to just as much also keep engaging in their activities? I would actually argue in that same sense that we also We've been using hammers as a society to build houses and other constructions for centuries, millennia. There's also a lot of people who has been smashed in their skull with a hammer too. Just as much as you can use a hammer to build a house, you can use the same tool to inflict a lot of bad. And it's a very important mindset, because in the end, it's just a tool you're creating for people to protect their own digital freedom and enforce this instead of being it taken away. Just as much, it's important for the journalists in between us, for the people who might want to contribute to WikiLeaks, for the people who might not want to share their hidden conversations with their mom and just want to make sure they have a sense of privacy while they're communicating with their girlfriend or with whoever they want to communicate. For the people who might be gay and at the same time they live in an authoritative regime that does not allow this. It's way more than just the bad people trying to abuse a system that is just as well a neutral system for everybody to use. Now, how do we keep this kind of an environment going? Because in the end, it's a rat race. You play with encryption models against organizations that potentially have more resources, might even be better organized, because let's be honest, decentralization is sometimes chaos. And having a lot of people work in between all of this chaos also requires them to somehow create a coordination effect to upkeep this effort. You see 3 images here which represent kind of the core of our, let's say, professional environment, where we deal with institutes, we deal with ourselves, builders, and just as much also the resources we need in general to keep going. Each one of these has specific people that are incredibly important to keep the things happening as we want them to happen. From politicians lobbying for digital privacy, to investment funds willing to put a risk and a bet behind a private communication application, or just as much any application that can enforce privacy or one of the other principles we talked about. To you and me, people in this room who are trying to learn more about privacy and cypherpunks and actually contribute to that. Remember my message, it's not just coding, not just writing code. It's very much contributing to actually proactively build this feature, because one thing that we do that the people who are trying to abolish these encryption systems don't, is that we don't need to deal with a huge amount of administrational, let's say, policies, to say it nicely. We need privacy, just as much as privacy needs you too. And this is not just a blanket statement that would say, okay, we always need privacy, but every day there are attempts where people are trying to change the laws, change the impact, deal with obtaining information, and just already by using tools or applications like Signal instead of Telegram, you are contributing to making sure that people know that not even, normal people can also use it. It's not just the black and white hats. Once encryption models and privacy tooling turns into the norm for our day-to-day activities, it gets very hard for a government to just take it away. Before I close off my talk, I want to obviously thank you all for being here and wish you a very nice upcoming conference. I would like to urge you to scan this QR code so I can take all of your money now. It's part of a EU feedback and consultation. Cypherpunks are active and proactive, and this is something we all can do right now. You can fill in a questionnaire that the EU is pushing towards privacy, cybersecurity expert, politicians, or anybody that's involved with sensitive data. Fill in the questionnaire as in they're currently trying to implement a law or in the early stages of implementing a law that would make metadata required to be kept by a lot of the digital companies we deal with. Metadata is one of the current bigger risks within privacy, particularly as we have encryption models that can hide the message. But the context of this message can still sometimes rat you out and who you are and where you are. And as such, thank you very much for being here, and I hope you all enjoy some good Romanian food.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Thank you so much, MF. That was absolutely fascinating. Guys, are there any cypherpunks in the room who'd like to ask a question of MF here? Because it's so rare that we've got an expert on this topic right here to be inquired with. I've got a question. Back in the 90s, it felt like governments were the main enemies, like they were the purveyors of censorship, that they were the main target for this movement. But nowadays, it feels like it's a bit more corporations that are in the target line. Do you agree with that statement? And do you feel like the battle's changed in any way?
There's definitely a sense of truth in that. I like to avoid the ideology of main enemies, especially as a government is rarely a centralized person, and within a government there's always people pro and against privacy. But companies definitely have shown up way more caring about the abolishment of your privacy, let's say so. Suddenly, in the 90s and 2000s, we went towards a surveillance capitalistic system where your data is worth a lot of money for people. Not just one person's data, but all of our data combined allows people to utilize this for, let's say, capitalistic purposes. Now, I'm not necessarily against somehow a variation of a capitalistic system, but at the same time, if your data is valuable and worthwhile, you should be able to sell it yourself if you want it to be sold, or have a say in that or not. The big difference, as in with an enemy compared to the enemy of a state or a corporation in here, is that likely, I'm saying likely, at least in the West, a company is not going to try to abduct you for an opinion that might be controversial towards the current political system, while a government might still engage in that. So you're having an economical risk and a privacy about your personal information that you share, and that's up to you if you should share it or not. And comparing that to back in the Cold War times, or even nowadays in some regimes, the risk of being abducted from your family. It's very different risks, but at the same time, not everybody is going to be abducted by their family, but probably everybody has some of their data taken by Meta and used it for their own purposes. So even though they have a different level, they're still both quite relevant to today. And I'm only expecting that it becomes, corporations become more relevant as time goes onwards as well.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So even though the context changed a bit, the movement stays the same. I love that. Do we have any questions from the audience here, guys? Feel free to either go through the QR code or put your hand up. One of our lovely volunteers will. Right over there.
So when you talked about anti-censorship and like anonymity and pseudonyms, I once said that the self-censorship is the worst kind of censorship, and I want your thoughts on that.
Could you elaborate for 1 second on your definition of self-censorship?
Right. So if I don't have privacy and anonymity for stating my thoughts, I might self-censor and not say things openly. And why it's for me worse than being censored by someone else, I can fight against someone else censoring me. I can try to work around that. But it's very hard to work around your own self-censorship and your own thoughts if you are worried about being looked at differently if you say something that may not be the mainstream opinion or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. I like to refer back to Foucault with the prisoner of constant surveillance. A human that feels that it's constantly being watched and there might be repercussions for their thoughts and actions will definitely censor themselves, because in the end they are still a prisoner of the society instead of actually being able to talk freely. Is it necessarily worse or better than somebody trying to generally censor you? I'm not sure. The only thing I am sure, it's also pretty bad. It's also about people should have the capability to self-express themselves. Now, that does not mean necessarily that we always should agree with everybody their expressions. Like there's a lot of people, their expressions I will not agree with personally, but that does not mean they should not have the ability to express that. And I think a really good way for people to actually avoid that mental feeling of feeling that you cannot self-express, and thus self-censoring one, is the ability to operate under a pseudonym. Because suddenly what your own thoughts are that you're trying to communicate with a larger society, it's now said by a pseudonymous person, and people might disagree or agree with this pseudonymous person. At least it will not necessarily lead back to you personally, and allows people to be a little bit more open-minded and self-expressive. Thank you.
Humankind had many technologies that are now irrelevant or were replaced by something else. Do you think ever humankind will not need the cypherpunk and everybody would be free to say anything and the big brother watching would not be a problem?
Although I would like to see this kind of, let's say, expressive utopia in that sense, I would also dare to argue that in our digital world, there are spaces available to do this. If we're talking in a physical world, it definitely gets harder, especially depending on where and how you are. You know, self-expressing yourself in Belgium is going to be very different than self-expressing you in Myanmar. It's a constant change of socio-economical and political environments that is also very much defined by where you are and when you are there, which will significantly adjust your capability to self-express. Does that mean that there will always be people who will respect your ability to self-express? I don't think so. Even not from an authoritative state mentality. Just in your environment, there are people who like to bully. There's people who like to make other people feel bad for their personal thoughts or their personal opinions. That's not even to the level of being abducted by the Stasi, for example. We live in a society where people have their own perspectives, no matter if they're good or bad, and sometimes people care very much against a certain perspective you might be for. Now, you cannot stop other people from sharing their own thoughts on top of your own personal perspective you've given, but at the same time, I think we are very lucky to live in a society where we have the ability to communicate with people all across the world, hidden behind a screen, from the safety and comfort of a safe room. And nowadays, with the tools we have available, we are the closest than ever, I would say, so to reaching an environment where you can continuously express yourself, maybe not always in physical, practical sense, but at least we have a digital alternative that can help towards that.
Awesome, thank you. We've got time for one more question. I'd like to go here to Consensus Builder 804. How do you feel about recent government actions against Tornado and the EU pushing against financial privacy tools like Monero?
I think a lot of it comes out of the general KYC fraudulent transactions that they're trying to punish. The government does not like you having money without them taking a cut of this money or taxation. The government does not like money to be distributed to people that they are not able to follow a trace. Especially because, it does hurt their capability to control and create, in their sense, a stable society. Stable society is specifically in their sense. That doesn't necessarily mean I'm agreeing to that. I think the beautiful thing about these tools is that although we definitely want to lobby for the benefit of privacy, at the same side, the government cannot just turn them off. This is why we have censorship-resistant, decentralized systems like Monero or other tooling similar to that. It's not like there's an on and off button that the government can control. Even during the Tornado Cash sanctions, the smart contract code was still there. You could still use it. You could still use privacy pools nowadays as well, or different kind of shielded transactions to obtain a similar goal. The government will always try to stay in control on their financial transaction level, specifically because it gives them a lot of information and details on what is happening and who is happening it with. Once you take that away, both the black hats and the white hats will benefit from this. And my personal opinion mainly goes towards the ideology of they can keep trying to turn it off, but as long as we keep building systems that can't be turned off, I wish them the best of luck. I'm not aware yet they have a a very big quantum computer that can break through our encryption models. And until they have that, good luck for them to try. And much likely by the time they do have that, we will have even a bigger or different algorithm that can again defend against that kind of an attack from a bigger system. So in one way, it's definitely annoying that they keep trying this, because it makes our work way harder to do it properly and digitally and keep trying to build these systems in the daylight, let's say so. On the other way, they can only try to restrict it. It's not something they can enforce with the technology we have today, which is the very nice thing about blockchains in general.